Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you join us here for our first Tocqueville lecture of the spring semester. The Tocqueville lecture series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. These are public and free lectures, which are on the campus of Jacksonville State University, and invite other institutions of learning and the surrounding community to come together to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by a generous grant from the Jack Miller Center. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions which continue to animate our national life. Tonight, we are happy and proud and honored to have Dr. Lucy Williams with us. Dr. Lucy Williams is an associate professor at Brigham Young University School of Law, where she teaches criminal procedure and First Amendment. Her research is at the intersection of constitutional law and American political thought, and explores the relationship between law, political rhetoric, patriotism, critique, and citizenship practices. Her current work considers whether and how American exceptionalism affects Supreme Court decision-making. In previous work, she has studied the exceptionalist features of Frederick Douglass's political thought. She also has analyzed Barack Obama's official funeral and memorial speeches to theorize and defend a more critical mode of official funeral rhetoric. Professor Williams earned her JD from the UCLA School of Law and her PhD in political science from UCLA. In 2019, she clerked for the Honorable Scott M. Matheson Jr. of the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. Prior to joining BYU law faculty, she was an assistant professor of political science at Brigham Young University. It is my pleasure to hand over the floor to our invited guest tonight, our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Lucy Williams. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gross, and thank you all for being here today. I'm very excited. I'm excited to be participating in this lecture series, and I'm really grateful that you would all take the time in the middle of your semester, at the end of a week, to be here and listen to me talk about some of my work. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I'm happy that we can still do this via Zoom, and I hope to be able to visit your campus at some point in the future. I'm going to just share my screen with you guys really quickly, and then we'll get going. Okay, so tonight I'm going to be sharing with you guys some of my most current research. This is a research project that I'm working on pretty actively right now, so I'm excited to hear your thoughts and feedback on it. But before I start, I have to issue a little bit of a disclaimer and an apology. When Dr. Gross invited me to speak several months ago, this project was still very new, and I knew I wanted to write about the Supreme Court and American exceptionalism, but I wasn't positive exactly what that project would look like. So I told Dr. Gross that I'd talk about how American exceptionalism has shaped the Supreme Court's civil rights decisions, because at the time that's the direction I wanted to take this project. Well, as I started actually writing and researching, I realized there isn't much legal research about American exceptionalism and the court. And so because of that, I realized that the gap I needed to fill, the scholarly contribution I wanted to make, is more general. It's not a specific project about American exceptionalism and civil rights law, but a broader piece about American exceptionalism and the Supreme Court in general. So there's been a bit of a shift. The project that I advertised about American exceptionalism and civil rights law is a little bit different than the one I'm actually going to be presenting tonight, which is a more general argument about exceptionalism and the Supreme Court. I've been telling myself that this shift is a good thing because it reflects good research habits. I pivoted because I found a different gap in the literature than the one I expected to find. But I also realized that to you all, this probably feels like what in contract law we call a bait and switch. I lured you in by promising one thing, and now that you're here, I'm giving you something different. So for those who are expecting civil rights, I'm sorry. There's a little bit of that in this presentation. But if you want the full shebang, you're going to have to convince Dr. Gross to invite me back when I've written the civil rights paper, which I plan to do in a few months. But I still hope there's going to be some interesting material, some interesting content in this presentation tonight. I'm going to be talking about flag burning and voter suppression and some very high-profile Supreme Court cases. So I hope that will be interesting, even to those of you who came expecting a more civil rights-oriented project. So with that out of the way, let's go over the agenda for our time together. I'm going to start out by talking about what exactly I mean when I say American exceptionalism. Also, for those of you who are starting out on embarking on your research agenda, I would encourage you to pick something that is easier to say than American exceptionalism, because every time I present this, I'm like, wow, why did I choose a topic that is such a mouthful? So forgive me in advance if I stumble over that. We're going to start though by talking about what American exceptionalism actually is, because it turns out that term is pretty loaded, and a lot of people, a lot of academics use it to mean very different things. So our first order of business is just pinning down our definitions, sorting out exactly what I mean by American exceptionalism. Next, I'm going to define for you two different modes of exceptionalism. A lot of scholars and people in general think that exceptionalism is some kind of monolithic, unified tradition, but I think it's actually pretty variegated, and that there are different types of exceptionalist thought. There are different ways of being an exceptionalist. So I'm going to introduce you to two modes of exceptionalism. One I call accomplished exceptionalism, and one I call aspirational exceptionalism. Next, I'm going to use a few examples from politics and political culture and popular culture to show you what these modes of exceptionalism look like in practice. So I'm going to give you some examples of both aspirational exceptionalism and accomplished exceptionalism. I'm going to show you what these look like in the real world and how they function. Then we're going to be pivoting to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to be arguing that these two modes of exceptionalism actually shape the way the Supreme Court analyzes legal issues in the cases it hears. So to show this, I'm going to be discussing two cases. There are lots and lots of examples, but because I don't think any of you want to stay here for the next week, I'm just going to focus on two cases that illustrate how the court draws on and uses these modes of exceptionalism. The first case is about flag burning, and the second one is a very recent case, a 2021 case about voting laws and voter suppression in Arizona. Then I'm going to talk about some of the implications of my research and why I think it's important. And then I'm going to turn the time over to you for questions and comments. So let's get into it. Our first order of business is to figure out what exactly American exceptionalism means. Now, when you guys think of American exceptionalism, it's likely, like when I say that term, there are probably a couple of things that come to mind. Some people, including many scholars, think of American exceptionalism simply as a descriptive term. American exceptionalism for these people means simply ways that America is different than other countries. So these differences could be good differences or bad differences. For example, America could be exceptional because we have a Bill of Rights. Or America could be exceptional because we have higher divorce rates than other countries. Doesn't matter if it's a good distinction or a bad distinction, but there is a group of scholars that treats the term American exceptionalism as simply a descriptive term, one that indicates or identifies ways that America is different or distinct from other countries. Other scholars think of exceptionalism as more of a normative phenomenon, as an ideology or worldview. But even these have very different definitions of what exceptionalism, of what that ideology, that worldview might entail. So some people think that American exceptionalism is a belief that America is the best, or that it's chosen, or that it has a special mission. Some people think that every country has its own variant of exceptionalism, because exceptionalism is essentially just patriotism or national pride. But all of these people in this category would think that American exceptionalism is a normative belief, a worldview that somehow shapes the way American citizens understand themselves and their role in the world, and a worldview that kind of leads American citizens to believe that they are special in some way. Now, I think there's merit to both of these approaches. And I think it's good that scholars understand and define the term American exceptionalism in different ways, because studying this phenomenon from different angles yields really important academic research. But for the purposes of my research, I define exceptionalism this way. In my work, as I understand it, American exceptionalism is the ideology or worldview, so I'm taking the normative approach here, that treats America as distinctive, superior and chosen, and tasked with a unique calling or responsibility. So in order to qualify as exceptionalism, I am only looking at worldviews that have a normative slant and that have a comparative slant, in that they think that America is not just different from other countries, but better than, and specifically better because it's been chosen and given this unique responsibility. That responsibility could be various things, right? It could be a responsibility to spread democracy, or a responsibility to spread equality, or a divine calling of some sort. But that is an essential component of exceptionalism, as I understand it, the idea that America has a unique role or responsibility to fulfill. Now, you might disagree with this formulation. You might think that there are better ways or different ways to understand exceptionalism, and that's wonderful, and I would love to talk to you about different ways of understanding exceptionalism. We could spend an entire semester talking about this. There is a library of academic literature debating how to define exceptionalism. So for the purposes of our work together tonight, I just propose, I realize this is a controversial proposition, but this is the definition we're working with. We're going to be thinking about exceptionalism as a normative worldview made up of these three components. That means I'm not going to be talking about descriptive claims of difference. I'm not going to be talking about how America is different than other countries, even though it's different in important ways. Instead, I'm just focusing on this belief that America is somehow distinctive and better than other countries because it has this unique responsibility that only it can perform. Now, to complicate things a little bit further, I'd like to suggest that there are actually multiple modes of exceptionalism, or multiple ways of enacting this belief that I have. I'm gesturing at my slide, which for me is over here, but if you're wondering why I'm pointing over there, there are multiple ways of enacting this belief that America is special and distinct and chosen. So tonight I'm going to focus in particular on two different ways of enacting this belief in American exceptionalism, two different types of exceptionalism. Now, when most of you think of exceptionalism, as I've just defined it, you probably think of people waving American flags and watching fireworks and singing the national anthem. You're probably imagining something that's very like rah-rah and triumphant and self-celebratory. That is one mode of exceptionalism that I call accomplished exceptionalism. Now, accomplished exceptionalism is the perspective, the worldview that says America is and always has been and always will be chosen and superior and tasked with a unique mission. So an accomplished exceptionalist thinks that America is always already exceptional. It's a foregone conclusion. This mode of exceptionalism has a couple of defining features, a couple of signature traits that will help you identify it out in the wild. So first, accomplished exceptionalism talks about American greatness as if it's an established fact. So it's going to use the indicative mood, a very confident, certain language. It will say America is great, not America might be great or could be great. Second, accomplished exceptionalism is pretty selective about how it discusses or engages with history. So this mode of exceptionalism really likes to emphasize America's successes, but it generally avoids talking about the ways that the country has fallen short or failed. Third, this mode of exceptionalism includes lots of praise and celebration. It is very rah-rah, but it very rarely includes critique. And fourth, this mode of exceptionalism, accomplished exceptionalism, really emphasizes American unity. It likes to describe the country as a unified and united whole. This kind of goes along with this selective and romanticized view of history. It portrays or describes the country as if we are completely unified, this ideal body of citizens who are all united for one cause, but it's not going to draw attention to any internal division. It's not going to draw attention to ways American citizens disagree with each other. So that's our first type of exceptionalism. This is the one you guys are probably most familiar with. When you think of exceptionalism, you're thinking of people who are very confident in America's status, who celebrate its successes, who are very proud of where America is. That's the accomplished mode. It's confident, it's assured, it treats America's chosenness, superiority, and mission as established facts. These are things that are true about America. But there is another type of exceptionalism as well, and I call this second mode aspirational exceptionalism. Now, aspirational exceptionalism also thinks that America is chosen and superior and distinct, but its orientation towards those beliefs is a little bit different. It thinks that those are possibilities, but not guarantees. So this mode sees America's chosenness, superiority, and mission as something that America could fulfill, but it also thinks that there's a chance that the country might fail to attain its exceptional potential. So like accomplished exceptionalism, aspirational exceptionalism has a couple of defining features. These are things that will help you identify when people are using it or people are invoking it. The first is that it's very contingent. It talks about America's greatness as a possibility, but not as a settled fact. So because of this, it's going to use language that's often conditional. It will say America could be great, not America is great. Next, this mode is a little bit more candid about how it engages with and discusses history. The aspirational mode is willing and in some cases eager to emphasize America's failures and its more inglorious moments. Sometimes it does this by downplaying progress the country has made. So if accomplished exceptionalism, it kind of ignores flaws, aspirational exceptionalism tends to ignore progress. Third, aspirational exceptionalism includes a lot of criticism and critique. It's often articulated through really harsh, jarring language. So it's not the comfortable, patriotic, I mean, I think it is patriotic, but it's not the comfortable, soothing, self-congratulatory language that we often expect to hear in contexts where we're looking for patriotic language. Instead, it can be pretty harsh and quite critical. Finally, it is very attentive to America's divisions. It's going to highlight the cleavages that fracture society. It's eager to explore and reveal the ways America is fractured. So that's our second type of exceptionalism. Like I said, aspirational exceptionalism is also committed to the idea that America is chosen and superior. It just thinks that those things are possibilities, not guarantees. So it's contingent, it's critical, it's harsh, but it is those things because it's calling on America to work toward potential, an exceptional potential that the country has not yet achieved. Now, everything I've said so far has been pretty theoretical and abstract. I've defined exceptionalism. I've told you there are two modes of exceptionalism, but I haven't yet really shown you what these might look like in the real world. So here we're going to take a break from the conceptual work and talk about real life politics and real political culture. So I want to talk for a moment about what these modes look like in real life. When in actual politics do we see accomplished exceptionalism? Where do we see aspirational exceptionalism? How are you going to know them when you see them? So let's start with accomplished exceptionalism. As I just explained, accomplished exceptionalism is the more celebratory and triumphant of the two types of exceptionalism. Because of that, it's very well suited for situations when speakers need to reassure their audience, when they need to rally supporters, or when they need to activate patriotic sentiments. So it's quite common to see accomplished exceptionalism in elections and campaign settings. A great example of this is in 2012, Republican candidate Mitt Romney kind of branded himself as the exceptionalist candidate. I'm going to give you some quotes from various speeches he gave. He insisted that America has been, present perfect tense, one of the greatest forces for good the world has ever known. He emphasized the country's duty to share its exceptional prosperity with all the corners of the earth. He also modeled the accomplished mode's aversion to criticism when he promised very emphatically and repeatedly, "I will never apologize for America." In 2016, Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton did the same thing. She used the accomplished mode's certain indicative mood to argue that this is a quote, "the United States is an exceptional nation." She also ignored the possibility that America has lost or could ever lose its exceptional character, and she instead insisted, we are always Lincoln's last best hope of Earth. She also described America as indispensable. So she didn't portray America as a country that could be a force for peace and progress, but one that always, already, and inherently is. Accomplished exceptionalism also shows up often in speeches that are delivered at moments of national significance, like at the beginning or end of a presidency, at a State of the Union address, on an important national holiday, things like that. Ronald Reagan's farewell address, his famous presidential farewell, is a really great example. This is the speech where Ronald Reagan famously calls America a city on a hill, which is actually a phrase borrowed from John Winthrop, who was an early American colonist and kind of the father of exceptionalism. But Reagan, so Reagan like kind of became the mouthpiece, I guess, the spokesperson for modern exceptionalism in a way. But his exceptionalism is distinctly accomplished. In that speech, if you go back and read it, he prioritizes celebration over critique. He says, like, it's my duty as a president to issue a warning, but then he doesn't actually give one. He just praises the country for how patriotic it is. He also shows the accomplished mode's kind of rosy history approach by recounting only America's best moments. So he never talks about internal conflicts. Instead, he says that America is teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. He also says that he has witnessed America's excellence, quote, all his political life, which suggests that the country's exceptionalism is constant and unchanging. It's something that he's never not seen. Political leaders also use the accomplished mode in moments of national grief and commemoration, which makes a lot of sense because accomplished exceptionalism is very unifying and very comforting. So on the evening of September 11th, 2001, George W. Bush described America using very accomplished terms. He said, America is, quote, the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. He also emphasized America's unquestionable excellence, and he suggested that like these terrorist attacks, quote, cannot dent the steel of American resolve and cannot keep America's light from shining. Barack Obama did the same thing in a lot of his memorial and commemorative speeches. One great example of this is a speech he gave on Veterans Day in 2012, where he confidently says, quote, America is and always will be the greatest nation on earth. That is is kind of the essence of the accomplished mode. Now, accomplished exceptionalism appears in lots of other contexts as well, at 4th of July celebrations, as sporting events. In fact, it's so commonplace that many Americans think it's not just a type of exceptionalism, but the type. This is the only way to articulate a belief in American greatness. Because of this, speakers who don't use the accomplished mode sometimes get accused of not being particularly exceptionalist. This happened to Barack Obama in 2009. During a press conference that year, he said, and this is his quote, "I am very proud of my country, but that does not lessen my interest in recognizing that we're not always going to be right." Immediately, critics accused him of not being an exceptionalist. In fact, he spent much of the rest of his political presidential career trying to persuade people that he was not an American apologist. This incident illustrates just how powerful and pervasive accomplished exceptionalism is. On one occasion, Barack Obama spoke without the superlative confidence that we usually see in accomplished exceptionalism, and because of that, many Americans concluded forever that he wasn't an exceptionalist at all. So now let's look at some real-world examples of aspirational exceptionalism. This is, as I have explained, a more caustic and critical and harsh type of exceptionalism. Because of that, it's not very well suited for campaigns or national celebrations. It's also, as I've told you, very attentive to America's flaws, so it's not particularly effective in situations where audiences are craving uncritical celebration. Instead, this mode appears most frequently and works best when speakers want to challenge the status quo, or critique institutions, or call for change. So an excellent example of an aspirational exceptionalist is Frederick Douglass. He was an abolitionist and social reformer in the 1800s who was very, very critical of America and specifically of American slavery. But he also embodied the aspirational mode's hopeful, ameliorative orientation because he always followed up his criticisms by affirming his loyalty to and hope for America's potential progress. So many of you have probably read Douglass's famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." He spares no criticism in that speech. He calls slavery fiendish and shocking. He says it's revolting. He calls it inhuman, disgraceful, and scandalous. But then he says, "Notwithstanding the dark picture I have presented, I do not despair of this country." So this combination of critique, but hope that America could overcome, become something better, perfectly exemplifies this aspirational orientation. Another example of an aspirational exceptionalist is James Baldwin. In the 1960s, Baldwin became known for his bold and biting criticism of America's racial inequality. But like Douglass, every time he offered a bleak assessment of the country's present or past, he also insisted, this is a quote, that it is perfectly possible to tap the energy of the country and to change and save ourselves. So he explicitly said often that his denunciations were motivated by aspirational love. He also famously insisted, many of you have probably heard this quote, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." That quote perfectly embodies the aspirational ethos. I love America more than any other country, and for that reason, I'm going to push it to be better. Contemporary figures also use aspirational exceptionalism when they're calling for or working for change. So NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick is a great example of this. In 2016, as many of you know, he made national news when he chose to sit during pregame national anthems. He explained that he was going to sit through the national anthem to critique America and to expose its racial inequalities. But he also maintained the aspirational mode's very hopeful posture by insisting that he was doing this because he loved the country. He said, "Love is at the root of my resistance." Like Douglas and Baldwin before him, he insisted that he was motivated by a desire to change the country, and he also promised that he would start standing again once America started making good on its promise of racial equality. So that shows that, like all aspirational exceptionalists, he actually believed that there was potential for progress. He wasn't just a naysayer. He was engaging in critique with the hope of pushing America forward to something better. Candidates and elected officials also sometimes use aspirational exceptionalist tropes, but because aspirational exceptionalism feels less patriotic, it's not as common to see elected officials do this. But they are likely to do it in moments of domestic crisis or when the public is very dissatisfied with the status quo. So Barack Obama again provides a good example of this. During his presidency, he gave dozens of memorial speeches honoring victims of natural disaster and war and other tragic events. And typically his speeches were very self-celebratory, very, very accomplished. But then the shooting at Sandy Hook happened, at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and he totally shifted his tone. So in that memorial speech, he did not give an idealized, comforting portrait of the United States. Instead, he drew attention to what he described as the endless series of deadly shootings that had plagued the country. He did not celebrate America's triumphs, but instead exposed and condemned its inaction in the face of gun violence. But he was also hopeful for the future. He insisted, he said several times, we can do better than this. He also said, quote, we can make mistakes. We will make mistakes, but we can find the strength to carry on. So if he was condemning America's shortcomings, he was doing that because he believed in the country's unique, exceptional potential and wanted to push the country forward toward a better and brighter future. All right, we have done a lot so far. So I'm going to quickly take stock of where we're at. So far we have defined exceptionalism. We've defined and explored two modes of exceptionalism, accomplished and aspirational. And I've given you examples of both modes. So now it's time to turn to the law. Now, in lots of fields, including political science, American exceptionalism is a big deal. There are lots of people who study it. There are lots of people arguing about what it is and why it's important. In law, in legal academia, that's not really true. There are a handful of legal scholars who study the way American law is different than law in other countries, but we already decided that's not really what we mean by American exceptionalism. Right? So there are a few legal scholars who do the distinctiveness, the descriptive type of exceptionalism, but there are very few who study exceptionalism the way we've been talking about as a normative worldview. At the same time, there are lots of legal scholars who study the Supreme Court and who are trying to predict how and why it makes its decisions. But those legal academics never comment on how the court uses or is influenced by the ideology or the worldview of exceptionalism. So these legal scholars are going to look at the court's ideological makeup and the justice's policy preferences and the justice's philosophies of constitutional interpretation and other things like that. And they'll say, this is how we explain how the court came to its decision. It's because Scalia is an originalist, right? But these scholars do not ever consider whether the court's views towards exceptionalism might shape its perspective on the legal issues in the cases it hears. So that's the gap my research aims to fill. I want to encourage legal scholars to start studying exceptionalism as a normative worldview, not as a descriptive thing, but as a normative thing. I also want them to consider how that normative worldview might affect the way the court makes its decisions. And I want them to do this because I think exceptionalism matters very, very much. In fact, I think that just like a justice's ideology or a justice's philosophy of constitutional interpretation, their views on exceptionalism might actually shape the way they analyze the issues in a given case. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples to show you what I mean. I'm going to go through two Supreme Court cases and show you how exceptionalism is at work in those opinions, and show you just how central exceptionalism can be to the court's analysis. The first case I want to talk about is Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, or Brnovich versus DNC. This is a brand new case. It was just decided in summer of 2021, and it was very controversial at the time. Here's how it came about. Arizona enacted a couple of voting laws. One required in-person voters to vote in the precincts where they were assigned, where their addresses were. If you vote in person, you have to go to your assigned precinct. Another one specified that only certain people could collect early ballots for other people. It had a list like you have to be next of kin or direct family relative, but it prohibited certain people, non-relatives, friends, things like that, from collecting early ballots and delivering them on behalf of another voter. Now, the DNC argued that these provisions, these two laws, were discriminatory to minority voters because they said many Native Americans and other minority voters in Arizona don't have cars to get to their voting places. So it's hard for them to vote at their assigned precinct, or they don't have permanent addresses that allow them to be assigned to a precinct, or they rely on tribal leaders to collect their ballots for them. So the DNC said these laws, they look neutral on their face, but they're actually making it really, really hard for minority voters to vote. So the DNC brought this case arguing that Arizona's laws violated a federal statute called the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits any voting procedure that, quote, results in denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. So the question before the Supreme Court in this case was, do Arizona's laws violate the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, by abridging the right to vote on the basis of race or color? The Supreme Court said no. The Supreme Court said that the Arizona's voting laws are fine. And in reaching that decision, exceptionalism played a huge, huge part. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that by going through the majority opinion and then through the dissenting opinion. We'll start with the majority opinion. The majority in Brnovich is very, very accomplished exceptionalist. It emphasizes America's current greatness and it downplays any need for further change. This is especially obvious in the way the majority talks about the VRA. The VRA, the Voting Rights Act, was passed as a response to America's long, long history of race-based voting discrimination. But the majority doesn't really talk about that history very much. Instead, it mentions it very briefly, but then it totally changes the focus and talks about how successful the VRA has been. So it talks about the VRA as a law that has heroically addressed the country's entrenched voting problems. It suggests the VRA has achieved a large measure of success in combating discriminatory voting practices. It also celebrates the fact that the VRA was revised and amended multiple times. It uses that as evidence to show that the VRA is proof that America's political system operates the way it should, because it's the subject or the object of the product, I guess, of legislative compromise. And it was revised and modified through our political processes. So the majority says as little as possible as it can about America's history of voting inequality, and instead just emphasizes the great things about the VRA. It also reveals its accomplished orientation through its omissions and its emphases. It downplays America's painful history. So unlike aspirational exceptionalism, which would draw attention to the country's flaws, the majority seems super eager to skim past them. So it briefly mentions poll taxes and literary tests, but it doesn't explain what those are or how much they impacted minority voters. Instead, in fact, the majority explicitly dismisses the relevance of America's racial history. It says historical background does not tell us how to decide these cases. An aspirational court would never do this. An aspirational court would be much more willing and eager to engage with history, especially when that history is ugly. The majority also de-emphasizes the alleged effects of Arizona's voting laws. So it doesn't consider really how these laws might affect Native American communities or other minority voters. Instead, it just suggests that the disproportionate effects of the laws are normal. It says it's virtually impossible for a state to devise rules that don't have some disparate impact. So we can't be too mad at Arizona for designing laws that sort of hurt minorities. The majority also says that any burden on minority is unremarkable, modest, and small. At one point, the majority even compares the burdens that these laws might have on minority voters to the same, they're about the same as the inconveniences of a trip to the DMV. The majority also shows its accomplished exceptionalism by championing this status quo. So it doesn't ever really consider whether America still has work to do to become more equal and fair. Instead, it says that striking down Arizona's laws will upset the country's very delicate federal-state balance. And the majority is really nervous about doing that. It says, look, maybe discriminatory voting practices threaten American values, but upsetting this federal-state balance would be much worse. And if we were to overturn Arizona's voting laws, that would be a big blow to federalism. So it warns, let's just keep things how they are, because there's nothing democratic about a wholesale transfer of the authority to set voting rules from the states to the federal courts. So in short, the majority's opinion is super accomplished. It describes an America that was once plagued by racial tension, but now has this great statute that's a compromise between the House and the Senate and between the federal and state governments. It also says that we might still have road bumps in voting, but where those exist, they're minimal, they're unremarkable, and they do not warrant an expansive interpretation of the VRA, because that, interpreting the VRA broadly, would just upset our comfortable status quo. Now let's look at the dissent. Justice Kagan writes the dissent, and in the very opening lines, she says that she disagrees with the majority's method of statutory interpretation. She says, quote, "This is not how the court is supposed to interpret and apply statutes," end quote. But she also makes it very clear that she's actually less concerned about statutory interpretation than she is about the fact that the court has yet again rewritten, in order to weaken, a statute that stands as a monument to America's greatness and protects against its basest impulses. This, I think, shows that she doesn't just agree with the majority's approach to statutory interpretation, she disagrees with the majority's views of exceptionalism. She thinks that the majority is refusing to give adequate power to a statute that could help America achieve its exceptional potential. Now, this becomes clearer when you look at the exceptionalism that Justice Kagan uses in her dissenting opinion. As you might guess, the dissent's view is thoroughly aspirational. Unlike the accomplished majority, which breezes past the country's voting rights problems, the dissent spends nearly 10 pages recounting the many ways America has failed to provide equal voting access for its citizens. It talks about how for much of American history, the guarantees of the Declaration of Independence ran to white men only. It describes the Civil War. It talks about the blood spilled for racial equality. It also talks about how even after the 15th Amendment, Black citizens faced a dizzying array of methods that were designed to prevent them from voting, including coordinated intimidation and violence. So the dissent is citing shocking evidence, statistical, textual, and social, to show just how bad the problem was. The dissent also gives vivid descriptions of contemporary problems. It talks about civil rights marches where protesters were beaten, knocked unconscious, and bloodied. The accomplished majority doesn't give us any of that sort of detail. The dissent also describes contemporary problems in America. It accuses the majority. It says the majority has hailed the good news that legislative efforts have shifted from vote denial to vote suppression, and then the majority just moves on as though the Voting Rights Act no longer has a problem to address. But the dissent clearly thinks there is still a problem to address. and the VRA matters. So the majority wants to pretend like the problem is fixed, it's done, we're good. The dissent says no, there's still very much a problem, and this act still needs to be interpreted broadly to address that problem. It also emphasizes how serious the Arizona voting laws are. As we saw, the majority thought these laws were just inconvenient, but the dissent gives us nearly 11 pages of statistics to demonstrate that these marginal effects are anything but marginal. But the dissenters are not all doom and gloom. If they insist on digging up America's faults, they do that because they genuinely believe that understanding America's racial history and understanding the problems the VRA was meant to address will help America achieve its exceptional potential. They say they argue that the VRA and its history remind us of the worst of America. The aspirational majority doesn't want to talk about the worst of America, but the dissent does. They say this statute reminds us that the country has fallen far short of its values and ideals. But the act, the VRA, also represents the best of America because it contains this monumental promise for what the country could become. So the dissent really seems to believe that if courts and Congress are honest about America's ongoing problems, the country could make good on its promises of democracy and equality. But this shining exceptional future is contingent. It's not a guarantee. And according to this dissent, it's going to require a much more expansive reading of the VRA than the one the majority is willing to offer. Let's look at another case. Our next case is Texas versus Johnson. This is a little bit older. The facts are these. This is one of my favorite Supreme Court cases. Many of you have probably studied it. The facts are these. 1984, Gary Lee Johnson burns an American flag at the Republican National Convention in Dallas, Texas. He's convicted for violating a Texas statute that prohibited desecration of venerated objects, including the American flag. So Johnson brings a lawsuit challenging the Texas statute and arguing that this law that prohibits burning flags violates his First Amendment rights of free speech and expression. The Supreme Court agreed with him. They said this law is unconstitutional, and in a 5-4 decision, they reversed his conviction. Now, Johnson is a really interesting case study of exceptionalism because it's a case that raises legal questions and exceptionalism questions at the same time. The legal questions in this case they center on the flag, which is itself a symbolic representation of exceptionalism. So to resolve the legal disputes, the court had to contemplate what makes America excellent. How should people enact an exceptionalist worldview? What do we do with people who don't believe in exceptionalism? It's really not surprising that exceptionalism features prominently in the court's analysis because the legal issues in this case are so tightly bound up with exceptionalism. Johnson is also interesting because of the court's ideological breakdown here. I told you that the court issued a 5-4 decision, but interestingly, it did not split along partisan lines or ideological lines. The majority was made up of Justices Brennan, Marshall, and Blackmun, who are liberals, Scalia and Kennedy, who are conservatives. The dissent has Rehnquist and O'Connor, conservatives, White, a center conservative, and Stevens, who's a liberal. So this unusual breakdown shows that exceptionalism and ideology do not always align. It also provides pretty strong evidence that in some instances, exceptionalism might be influencing judicial decision-making as much as, if not more than, ideology does. So let's start by looking at the majority opinion. In Brnovich, we saw the majority take an accomplished angle, but here the majority's opinion is very aspirational. We see this first in the majority's attitude toward criticism. Accomplished exceptionalism, as we know, is generally pretty uncomfortable with critique, but in Johnson, the majority goes out of its way to defend people like Mr. Johnson who challenge or question the government. The majority celebrates and safeguards opinions or the right to express opinions which are defiant or contemptuous, even when those opinions are directed at a sacred symbol like the flag. The majority also suggests that criticism such as Johnson's is a sign and source of our strength. In other words, Criticism is a feature of America's greatness, not a threat to it. The majority also shows its aspirational orientation by recognizing and acknowledging the fissures and fractures within society. So accomplished exceptionalism would dismiss or downplay dissident voices and try and make it seem like we're all this happy kumbaya family. The majority says that's actually not the case. It talks about the war at Vietnam. It talks about other moments of national division and conflict. And it says that citizens can have different opinions, and it celebrates the constitutionally guaranteed freedom to be diverse or even contrary. Whereas accomplished exceptionalism would disavow conflict and disagreement, the majority instead insists that society should expose falsehood and fallacies through discussion. So the majority opinion here is very eager to acknowledge that we are a fractured country and to suggest that that's not actually a bad thing. The majority also adopts a very contingent, forward-looking tone. So instead of talking about America's current greatness or its past greatness, it talks about how the country could make mistakes. For example, it warns if we decide this case incorrectly, we might dilute the freedom that the flag represents. It also praises the nation's resilience a couple of times, which is in a way an acknowledgement that the country has faced and will again face phases where it's less than perfect and where it has to persist in spite of imperfection. But the majority also expresses this aspirational faith in America's grand future. So it says it's very confident that if it forbids criminal punishment for burning the flag, that will not endanger the special role of the flag. It also says that if the country affirms the guarantees of the First Amendment, the flag's deservedly cherished place will be strengthened, not weakened. It's very confident that if they do the right thing, if they safeguard the values of the First Amendment, even when that's uncomfortable, America could achieve its exceptional potential. The dissenters don't share this view. Instead, they look at the case through the very uncritical and confident and self-celebratory lens of accomplished exceptionalism. This accomplished perspective is very evident in their approach to critique. Unlike the majority, which celebrates criticism, the dissenters disapprove of Johnson's conduct, which they just describe as disrespectful burning of disrespectful public burning of the flag. And unlike the majority, which wants to protect critical speech even when it's painful, the dissenters suggest that some things, including the American flag, are too sacred to be critiqued. So they condemn the majority for treating the flag as just another symbol about which opinions pro and con must be tolerated. The flag is beyond the realm of critique, they say. The dissenters also show their accomplished exceptionalism through their celebratory backward-looking orientation. So unlike the majority, which highlights the potential for future progress, the dissenters focus their attention squarely on the past. They talk about how the flag has always been a prominent sacred symbol. They give us this long, long account of America's most triumphant moments. They talk about the flag uniting people during the Revolutionary War, and they talk about Francis Scott Key writing the national anthem, and they talk about how the flag motivated troops during the Civil War and during World War I and II. They do not discuss America's less glorious moments, but instead they emphasize that for more than 200 years of our history, the flag has come to be a visible symbol embodying our nation. They even go so far as to describe America as a perpetually indestructible union composed of indestructible states. So both of these cases, Johnson and Brnovich, they show just how central American exceptionalism can be to the court's analysis. In both cases, the court is dealing with legal issues, but it also seems to be wrestling with its views on exceptionalism, and those views seem to really shape the way it conducts its legal analysis. The justices who are more accomplished are a little more likely to uphold the status quo and a little less likely to mandate sweeping change. And that makes sense, because if America's always great, if it's already perfect, why would we mess with it? Meanwhile, the aspirational exceptionalist justices seem more likely to issue bold and progressive rulings. They're striking down laws, they're overturning convictions. This also makes sense. If America has a long way to go before it reaches its potential, then justices had better be pushing hard to get it there. So I've been talking for a long time now. I want to leave some time for questions and answers. But before I wrap up, I'd like to quickly talk about some of the implications of what we've been discussing tonight. Why does any of this matter? I want to acknowledge right off the bat that it's possible that exceptionalism is just a rhetorical thing. It's just a stylistic device that justices use to make their opinions beautiful or pretty or interesting. I think exceptionalism is more than that, but even if it is just rhetorical flourish, I think we still need to pay attention to it. Justices are sophisticated users of language. So if they're using exceptionalism as a rhetorical device, they must be doing that because they know exceptionalism does productive rhetorical work. And I think it's worth studying what that work is. It may be that justices use exceptionalism to gain legitimacy. The accomplished justices might use their accomplished exceptionalism to show why they're reserved in their rulings. They call on the tropes, they invoke the tropes of accomplished exceptionalism to say, hey, we can't be bold. America's already where it needs to be, so we need to be reserved in our judicial reasoning. It may also be that aspirational judges are using the aspirational mode to defend or justify or legitimize why they're pushing for bold legal interpretations and broad change. So even if exceptionalism is just a rhetorical device, I think it warrants attention as one of the ways courts craft and maintain their legitimacy. But I think exceptionalism matters even more than that. In fact, I think it actually shapes the way justices view the case. I think it might be outcome determinative. I need to do more research and study before I can make that claim in a statistically defensible way. But I think there is strong reason to believe that exceptionalism might be informing the justices' reasoning. And if that's true, then we need to understand exceptionalism for a few other reasons. First, understanding exceptionalism, understanding the relationship between exceptionalism and Supreme Court decision-making will enhance our academic understanding of how and why the court reaches its conclusions. Scholars are already trying to do this. They're always trying to figure out, why did this justice rule this way? How are they going to rule in this case? Understanding exceptionalism and how it influences Supreme Court decision-making could help us in that endeavor. Second, understanding exceptionalism will alert judges to a potential source of judicial bias. It will help them understand how this previously unstudied worldview might be shaping their judgments. We want justices and judges to be attentive to potential sources of bias that could creep into their reasoning and into their opinions. And so if we're more aware of the relationship between exceptionalism and judicial decision-making, we might help judges be more aware of and self-conscious of how they approach their craft. Finally, understanding exceptionalism will help lawyers be more persuasive and effective advocates. If we understand how judges view exceptionalism, then we can craft arguments that will be more persuasive to certain judges. I might know I'm arguing in front of an accomplished exceptionalist judge. I should not be invoking the aspirational exceptionalist mode, and vice versa. So in short, I think this work has meaningful implications for academics and for lawyers and for judges. I also just find it tremendously fun. The exceptionalist themes in Supreme Court rhetoric and decisions are thoroughgoing. I've given you 2 examples of cases where they show up, but they really are everywhere. And so I look forward to studying them more. I hope you guys have enjoyed our time together tonight. I'm happy to take questions about this, about cases I haven't discussed. I've also heard that many of you are maybe interested in going to law school. So if you have questions about law school generally or things like that, I'm happy to discuss that as well. But for now, I will stop my share and turn it over to Dr. Gross, who's going to help me manage the Q&A.
Well, first, I want to thank Dr. Williams, Professor Williams, very much. I missed this part of when we were in person, so I hope you guys are clapping with me back at home, because that was an excellent presentation and really exciting. So if you have a question, please go ahead, just raise your hand. I can unmute you and turn on your camera. If you just want to ask your question through voice only, that's fine too. But if you have a question, go ahead and just raise your hand, and I will be happy to hand over the microphone and the video to you so you can ask a question here to Professor Williams. Yes, I see here we got our first hand up. I am going, okay, here we go. We should have everything there to allow Michael to ask a question.
I assume you mean this Michael, right, Ben?
Yes, I think so.
That is correct. That is correct.
All right, cool. Very cool. I have a generic name. Hello, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was really amazing and lovely and wonderful. I'm Dr. Boynton. I teach at JSU. And a lot of my work and research looks at American popular culture. And I've dabbled tangentially on American exceptionalism too. My question for you, and I loved your presentation, it has resonated beautifully. My question for you is, in your research and in your own work, have you looked at all in terms of anti-intellectualism and how it might impact your approach, particularly your model of American exceptionalism? It seems like, and this is just a knee-jerk reaction. It seems like aspirational exceptionalism seems to have a greater reliance on critical thinking and an empirical approach to intelligence, whereas accomplished exceptionalism might not emphasize those things. So I was just wondering if you've given that thought, if you've come across anything in your work in terms of how anti-intellectualism might play a part in all of this.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think you're right that, at least in terms of its engagement with history, that the aspirational mode is maybe more willing to engage in history in an intellectual way. But at the same time, the aspirational mode is filtering out important parts of history as well. The aspirational mode is not looking at, it doesn't want to talk about the ways where we have legitimately made progress, and it's probably exaggerating failures just as the accomplished mode is exaggerating successes. I get this feedback a lot, and I realize I need to work on this. Like, I don't want to present one of these modes of exceptionalism as a good one and one as a bad one. I don't want to say that one is liberal and one is conservative, because I really don't think they are. I think there are useful uses for both of them, and I think there are examples of conservative justices using the aspirational mode and vice versa. So this is a helpful question for me because it reminds me again that that still is probably coming through in my presentation. I don't want to say accomplished exceptionalism is anti-intellectual and aspirational exceptionalism is intellectual. I think accomplished exceptionalism is probably a little bit more emotional than aspirational exceptionalism is. But they're both doing emotional, they're appealing to different emotions, and they're being anti-intellectual about different things. But that's a helpful question for me. I realize I didn't really give you a responsive answer. My answer is thank you for pointing that out, and that's something that I will think about and work into my framing a little bit more, because I think it would be helpful to maybe emphasize that they're both blind to certain historical truths, and they're both anti-intellectual in their own way.
Cool, excellent. Yeah, a little more pathos than logos, maybe, right?
Yes, but, exactly.
Oh, cool, yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and I would take you out to coffee if you were here.
I know. I wish I could be there, but hopefully, if the pandemic ever ends.
Well, thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Wonderful. Our next question comes from Paul Hathaway. So let me get the mic and the camera loud there. And again, please continue to just raise your hand and we'll work through the queue here. But the next question here is coming from Paul Hathaway. And you will just have to unmute yourself. There we go. Perfect.
All right. I thought you had control of everything, Ben.
Hi, Paul.
You're muted there again. There we go.
I reiterate Mike's thank you. This was great. I've got one comment and one question.
Great.
The comment, when you talk about aspirational exceptionalism, you rely on race.
Yeah.
And I believe that there's a lot of other things, healthcare, education. I mean, there's lots. And I would just say, instead of relying on race, maybe we expand that, what you're looking at when discussing that. Because I think that, there's a lot of aspirational exceptionalism, a lot of other things that could, explain that. So that's my comment, and you can do with it, like my students, you can do with it what you want, right? My question is, do you believe that when we're looking at Supreme Court justices, can we ask questions about, and maybe, well, let me ask this first. Does the cognitive dissonance of the aspirational versus the assumptive dissonance, is one higher than the other? Does one group have higher cognitive dissonance than another? And if so, can we use that when we are looking at judges to sit on the Supreme Court? Because we know they'll never answer on cases, but can we ask questions that would lead us to their cognitive dissonance? And if that is higher, if there's a correlation that if they're assumptive, well, they have if they have a higher cognitive dissonance, then we can kind of put them in that category. Does that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so I'll respond to both of these points. First, I absolutely agree with you that aspirational exceptionalism shows up in lots of other contexts. In fact, I think it's more interesting outside of the racial context, because in the racial context, aspirational and accomplished exceptionalism generally fall right in line with ideology. Your conservative, people who are conservative on racial issues are probably going to be accomplished exceptionalists. People who are progressive on racial issues are going to be aspirational exceptionalists. That's not that interesting, right? Because that's just like, oh, you've got another label for the same story we all know. When you move outside of the race context, it gets a lot more interesting, because in the free speech context, in religion cases, in Second Amendment cases, you suddenly have conservative justices who are being very aspirational, and liberal justices who are like, no, this is too much, let's slow down. So yes, I plan to expand beyond the race context. That is a very helpful suggestion. It's underway. I think that I picked race cases in large part because it's easy to show what I'm trying to illustrate, but you're right that it shows up in other contexts as well. Your second question, I think, is fascinating. I haven't, I haven't thought about whether one mode of exceptionalism yields a higher cognitive dissonance than another, but I think that part of what I'm arguing is that just as we are grilling Supreme Court justices on, like, are you an originalist or not? How would you interpret this? What are your views on precedent? I think we should be grilling them on what are your views of American exceptionalism, because clearly these views shape the way they view legal issues. So I'm not sure if being an accomplished exceptionalist is disqualifying, or being an aspirational exceptionalist is disqualifying. But I think it's something we should be aware of when we're nominating and thinking about, and by we, I mean we don't really have control. The powers that be should be thinking about, because if we're asking them, would you overturn Roe v. Wade? If we're asking what do you think about stare decisis? If we're asking what's your philosophy of constitutional interpretation, I think we should also be asking, what are your views on American exceptionalism? Not because a particular view could be disqualifying, but because that will give us a strong indication of how they might view certain issues.
That's what I think. I think the higher the cognitive, the disconnect between what reality is and what I want it to be, the higher that is, I would think they're going to be more assumptive.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I would think that, but you let me know when you figure that out.
When you monetize it. When you monetize it.
Great. And thank you again this was great. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun. So thanks for listening, everyone.
Awesome. Our next question is coming from Benjamin May. So
Okay.
Benjamin, I'll get your camera and mic open, and you'll just have to turn those on. And he has our next question here.
All right, cool. Forgive me if you hear the noise in the background. I have a 2-month-old, so that's what that is. But
No
first off, Dr. Williams, thank you so much for just giving this. I teach 7th grade geography, so being able to have this level of discourse is extremely refreshing. So it's awesome, and reminds me of my desire to teach at a, either some older children at some point. But anyway, so my question for you is, in your view, what are the origins of American exceptionalism in terms of perhaps its earliest examples? When you mentioned the city on the hill, the city on a hill idea that was in Reagan's speech, that was a quote from, I think you said, John Winthrop. That reminded me of like that kind of Puritan idea that had a significant influence in kind of America's founding. But yeah, so I was interested in your views on the origins of that, and also, to what extent is this is American exceptionalism, like this kind of exceptionalism, unique to the U.S.? Are there other countries that you think have a similar degree of like this view that that their particular country has kind of this special role and is it kind of has like a special, unique role to fulfill as being one of the best, nations in the world that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, these are both really, really good questions. So as far as the origins of American exceptionalism go, most historians and intellectual historians would trace it back to the Puritan era and to the colonial era. That there was something about the we are going out to forge our own way in the wilderness. In John Winthrop's the speech you should read if you're interested in this is called "On a Model of Christian Charity." John Winthrop gave it aboard a ship that was coming over to colonize the Massachusetts Bay Colony, I believe, and he talks about we are going to be proving we're the test of God's mission. If we fail, then that's where the city on a hill, this biblical phrase, comes from. If we fail, everyone's looking at us. If we succeed, everyone's looking at us. So I think there was something about America starting as this experiment, this clean slate, that everybody's looking at us to see how we do, that generated this, and therefore we're extra special, and therefore we have this unique mission. That I think relates to your second question: is exceptionalism unique to the United States? I think the way I define it, it is. I think that every country probably has some variant of we're special. But I don't think, I think other, and I should say, I'm not a comparativist, so this is not, I'm speaking out of my wheelhouse here, but it seems to me that other countries' versions of exceptionalism are a little bit more cosmopolitan, right? It's we're exceptional, but so are you in your own way. And we do pasta really well, but you make really good pastries. And America's exceptionalism is not quite. It's a little bit more mutually exclusive. We're exceptional because other people are not, and other countries can't be exceptional like we are. So I do think that there's something a unique flavor to America's American exceptionalism. Though a comparative project would be very interesting to look at how other countries talk about themselves and think about themselves in exceptionalist terms.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you so much for answering both of those questions.
Thank you. These are great questions. Also, I should say I can totally relate to the 7th grade thing, because when I was working on my PhD, my little brother was my roommate, and he was doing Teach for America and teaching 7th graders, and he would come home and be like, "Can I read a chapter of your dissertation?" It's go knock yourself out. But you're doing very noble work, so thank you for educating the next generation.
Thank you. I'm doing my best. When I found out a few weeks ago that about 20% of my kids were not sure what country they lived in. So we're
You're
getting
doing important work, but thanks, Benjamin.
Sure.
And I second that. You keep up the good fight. We appreciate everything you're doing there. Our next question is coming from Vincent, Vincent West. So I'll get his microphone and camera out here, and Vincent has our next question.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
I can. Hi, Vincent.
Yeah, hello. I'm a graduate student at Alabama.
Cool.
I love conversation like this. But in the book, Reloaded by Roxanne Dunbar, a big conclusion she makes, equating America with Israel and South Africa. This whole exceptionalism, the idea of we are a nation of laws and yada yada. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, this is.
You're not compared to this, but yeah.
Thank you. So that's not a book I have read, but the connection to I've written it down, so I'll take a look at it. Thank you for drawing that to my attention. The connection between America and Israel is in exceptionalism is I'm speaking now about ancient Israel, is a very common one. Just as the ancient Israelites viewed themselves as God's chosen people, there are lots of common threads with that type of rhetoric and discourse that like bleed into America's exceptionalist tradition. They draw on a lot of that same rhetoric of chosenness that we see among the ancient Israelites. So yeah, definitely overlap there. The book you said is called Freeloaded.
Reloaded.
Freeloaded. Okay, great. I am going.
The book as a whole is about gun violence, but.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I will look at that. That sounds like that could be helpful for my research. So thank you so much. And good luck with your graduate studies as well.
Yeah, thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
We have time for a couple more questions. So I said we're open in the queue right now, but I guess I'll take advantage, if you don't mind, to ask one question.
I'd love it.
I'm just wondering about the role of judicial independence
Yeah.
with American exceptionalism, as you brought up candidates or office seekers. And I'm wondering, would we think, and once again, this is my question, would we think the state Supreme Courts might act differently with regards to this given their selection modes? Or would state Supreme Courts stay out of this because they're not the highest court of the land? But would the state Supreme Courts be an interesting place to look at, given that judicial independence exists for some and doesn't exist for some at the state?
Yeah. No, I think that could be, yeah. I haven't looked at this beyond the Supreme Court. I would guess that exceptionalism is going to be most relevant to constitutional questions, questions that ask the courts to think about or engage with, like questions about what the nation, questions of national importance and about our national identity. So I wouldn't be surprised if lower courts that are dealing with like insurance disputes are not talking about exceptionalism when they're deciding like what Oklahoma's indemnification laws are. But I hadn't thought about judicial independence, like whether more. I guess would your hypothesis be that the Supreme Court can engage more in exceptionalism because it is more judicially independent?
That's what I'm wondering. Also, the state law, I was thinking of those court cases that work through the state that are about civil liberties or civil rights, not the. But yeah, like that's what I wonder if the Supreme Court, because of its independence, can engage in American exceptionalism in ways that Congress or the president or others can't.
Well, yeah, and for Congress or the president, they're exception, like they might be bound to a particular type of exceptionalism, right? I have to be exceptionalist in the way my party wants me to be exceptionalist. Or with Barack Obama during his presidency, like I have to try to prove to America that I'm exceptionalist in the way they want me to be exceptionalist. Whereas as the court can maybe experiment with these different modes of exceptionalism or draw on them at different times. I think that's very likely, and that's a really helpful consideration. I do think that part of what I'm maybe learning, and I should know this, like I am a law professor. I shouldn't still be surprised by this, but I think part of what I'm learning is that I'm not sure that even the Supreme Court is as independent as we want them to be. Part of the way I initially framed this paper was like, the Supreme Court, we want them to be rhetorically neutral. We want them to just say what the law is. And look, they're not being rhetorically neutral. And I presented that to my colleagues and they were like, none of us thinks the Supreme Court is rhetorically neutral. So I'm a little bit late to the game on that. But I do, I guess I do think that if you're like tightly affiliated with a party, you are probably more constrained in how you can articulate your views on exceptionalism, because I don't think exceptionalism is the same as ideology, but I think that it feels like it sometimes. And so it may be that the Supreme Court, it's a more meaningful part of Supreme Court decision making because they aren't bound to a particular party affiliation.
No, I thought that would be an interesting, but look, especially as you say that there's sometimes exceptions to what we would expect or changes in the exceptionalism, is that institution of the framework of the institution of the court. But I would be quiet because we have another question here from Celeste. So I'm going to hand it over to her. I'm going to open up her mic and her camera to ask you our next question.
Hello.
Hi, Celeste.
Hi, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it extremely interesting. It came up on my Facebook feed.
Wonderful.
And so I popped in last minute, and the title was very interesting. And I'd like to just encourage you in your research. I'd like to see it turned into a TED Talk. I think it can definitely help the average person have another way of listening to candidates and evaluating candidates. And just like Paul said, I would like to see some other examples of aspirational persons besides Black people, really. Because I think sometimes if you present it that way, it will turn off people. And when I saw it, the first thing I thought was, my goodness, are we the only people who call America to its greatness? So I would like to see someone else. I think I was correct in that.
No, thank you. That is really helpful feedback. And that's actually, so I wrote my dissertation on American exceptionalism. My dissertation was like doing the work of just distinguishing between two types of exceptionalism. Because my project was to say, like, you can be an exceptionalist and be really critical. We don't have to dismiss these people as unpatriotic. They are meaningful contributors. And it just so happened. So other people I discussed in my I wrote a chapter on Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. So there are white aspirational exceptionalists as well. But I did have a lot of questions of readers of my dissertation asking, is aspirational exceptionalism an African-American political thought tradition? Is it a tradition of African-American political thought? So I think there are lots of great examples of Black aspirational exceptionalists, but you're right that I don't want to say that it's just a Black tradition. I think that will make it, some people will be less open to it if I say that.
But I do believe that it's a Black tradition because I do believe that we do call America to its greatness.
Absolutely.
And that's been our role in this country.
Absolutely. And I think also it's very closely linked to the prophetic tradition.
Yes.
So there is some overlap as well there, but there are certainly white thinkers and white judges who espouse the aspirational orientation, and so I need to be more inclusive of those in my work. Thank you.
But again, it was excellent, and I do encourage you to see if you can do a TED Talk. I think people would love to hear it.
The best compliment an academic could get, because usually people are like, your work is so dry and boring and only my mom reads it. So that is a very kind compliment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks.
Wonderful, and I'm glad you could join us from Facebook. I sometimes wonder when we run ads if anybody's watching, and so thank you for joining us, Celeste, and thank you for coming in and being part of this with us. I think we have time for one more question, and so I see one hand left up, and it's going back to Paul Hathaway. So he, I think, has the ability here to unmute himself and open up his camera again to ask another question. Oh, it's a different Paul with him. It's Paul
It's a
Beasley.
different Paul. It's Paul Beasley.
Sorry, Ben. Sorry.
We've been watching your we've been watching your presentation together. I'm in history and late 19th, early 20th century history, and I do a lot of nationalism. So, but just the whole discussion, because I would like to complicate your project infinitely, is this idea to have you looked at the historic arc of this? And think about how have we become more aspirational over the years rather than more celebratory. I mean, certainly at the turn of the last century, as my daughter has taught me to say, late 1800, 1800s to 1900s, we're very focused on this nationalistic, exceptionalistic. I mean, that is our story, right?
Yeah.
And so, I would think you would see a shift, certainly around Brown, but even before then, with some of the earlier labor cases, into the 30s, with the shift of the court and just thinking about that in cultural context, or not.
I love this question. Thank you so much. My answer is I have not looked at this historically yet, but that is on the agenda. So this project is really just like convince legal academics that we need to pay attention to exceptionalism. Once I've done that, the two directions I want to go with this are like one, trace exceptionalism through a particular substantive area of the law. How does exceptionalism show up in First Amendment cases? How does it show up in civil rights cases? The other option, and these are not mutually exclusive, is trace it historically, because I think there are certainly times where the court, across all subject areas, and where multiple courts, right, not just the same membership, are probably more accomplished. I think even probably in the last 2 years, our society is shifting to become more aspirational. I don't know that the court is, but I think society is, specifically after George Floyd and all the subsequent protests and such that went on. I think it's like becoming more socially acceptable to be an aspirational exceptionalist, and we are getting better at recognizing aspirational exceptionalists as patriots. So I'm sure there have been interesting shifts. I think it would be really interesting to identify when those happen and how they correspond with certain historical events. So I love that idea. I haven't done it yet, but when I do start working on that, I will come talk to you.
Well, I think that the way that you laid it out at the start of the program was exceptional. Was excellent, that you really laid out that division really clearly, and that actually you potentially are opening up a whole new way to look for legal historians, for PhD students, for legal historians. So, you should think about writing some kind of something that you can sell as a textbook at some point. And just was Hathaway sort of the other Paul sort of our questions are very close, because it seems to me that that this is a way to approach Supreme Court justices in particular, and that I'm an academic, but I'm an entrepreneur at heart, thinking about the way that you may be able to monetize that. I hope, I don't think we have any senators on watching tonight, but so, keep that as you think. So again, excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Both of your comments were incredibly helpful. I've been taking notes. Thank you so much for this feedback.
Hey, Lucy, can I ask you, are you from the Provo area?
I'm from Salt Lake. Well, I grew up in Park City, Utah. So Provo feels very far away and very foreign to me, but it's only like 30 miles. So
yeah, I grew up in Idaho, so I'm very familiar with. So it was our place to go.
I love Idaho. I feel like Idaho is one of America's best kept secrets.
And let's keep it that way.
Hey, Ben, I'm here too.
Well, I'm glad we have good fellowship and companionship watching in on this tonight too. It really has been a pleasure. So once again, thank you very much to Dr. Williams for joining us tonight. We really do appreciate you sharing all this research with us. And I think I won't be the first to say, I'll be the first, but won't be the last to say it. We are really looking forward to seeing the additional research you have and to bringing you back physically to campus when we can to share that with us.
I would love that. Thank you to all of you who came and stayed and asked great questions. I love having people engage with my work, so thank you so much. And thanks, Dr. Gross, for giving me this opportunity.
It's been wonderful. So again, I want to thank the Jack Miller Center for their generous support of our lecture series. It's through their support that we're able to bring Professor Williams to you. It's through them that we're able to keep the Tocqueville lecture series going. If you would like to know more about the Tocqueville lecture series or the Jack Miller Center, please follow our Facebook page. You can also see past presentations, or give me some time to get this one posted, but you watch this presentation too on our YouTube channel. And I hope you will consider joining us for our next lecture, which is going to be on Thursday, March 31st at 5:30 p.m. We'll be hosting Dr. Joseph Nippenberg of Oglethorpe University, and his presentation is entitled Forgetting or Denying the Good, the True, and the Beautiful, the Precarious Place of Liberal Education in the Contemporary Universe. Thank you all again for sharing your night with us. We hope you had a wonderful evening. I think we all can agree. Once again, a round of applause. Thank you, Professor Williams. And we look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.